No original writings from Hannibal Barca survive. That's the first thing you need to know. The greatest military mind of the ancient world left no memoirs, no detailed letters explaining his defeats, no philosophical reflections on what went wrong at the moment that changed everything. But we don't need his exact words. Because what Hannibal wrote about his greatest defeat is preserved in something far more revealing, in the actions he took after losing everything, in the tactical analysis implicit in his decisions, in the letters he did write to the Carthaginian Senate, and in the one sentence, just one, where he finally admitted he was beaten. His name was Hannibal Barca. For 17 years he had held Rome in a vice grip. He had crossed the Alps with war elephants in winter. He had crushed 86,000 Roman soldiers at Cannae, the worst military defeat in Roman history. He had dominated the Italian peninsula for over a decade without reinforcement, without relief, living off the land while Rome tried desperately to figure out how to kill him. Then, in 202 BCE, on a plain near the town of Zama in North Africa, he lost everything. This is what Hannibal understood about losing. And it's far more honest than victory. To understand what Hannibal wrote about defeat, you have to understand a man who had spent his entire adult life never experiencing it. Hannibal Barca was born around 247 BCE into the most powerful military family in Carthage. His father, Hamilcar Barca, was the Carthaginian general who nearly broke Rome during the First Punic War. When Hamilcar was negotiating the peace that ended that war, he allegedly made his 9-year-old son swear an oath on the altar: hatred for Rome, eternal, implacable hatred. Whether that story is true or not, and historians debate it captures something essential about Hannibal. From childhood, he was being prepared for one thing: war with Rome. As a young man, Hannibal served under his brother-in-law Hasdrubal, learning siege warfare, learning cavalry tactics, learning how to move massive armies across hostile terrain. By the time he took command of Carthaginian forces in Spain at age 26, he was already the most capable general his city had produced since his father. In Spain, Hannibal was virtually untouchable. He won every major engagement. He expanded Carthaginian territory. He crushed Roman allies. For those early years, before he ever faced Rome directly, Hannibal had no experience with defeat. He had trained his mind to win. He had engineered his tactics, his logistics, his leadership style around the assumption that victory was not just possible, it was inevitable. Then he invaded Italy. The crossing of the Alps in winter with an army and 50-some war elephants is one of the most legendary military achievements in history. Thousands died in the snow, but those who survived emerged on the other side tempered, hardened, stripped of everything except loyalty to their commander and faith in his genius. And then Hannibal began to show Rome something it had never experienced: a general who could beat them at their own game. At the Trebia River in 218 BCE, Hannibal annihilated a Roman army. At Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE, he killed 15,000 Romans in a single day, one of the largest mass casualty events in the ancient world. The Romans thought Trebia was bad. Trasimene showed them what a true military catastrophe looked like, but even these victories did not prepare Rome for what came next. At Cannae, in the heel of Italy, Hannibal faced an even larger Roman army, approximately 86,000 soldiers. The Romans outnumbered him. They had learned that standing toe-to-toe with Hannibal in linear formation was suicide, so they massed their forces deeper, trying to bull rush through the center of his line and overwhelm him with sheer weight. Hannibal had predicted exactly this. His infantry deliberately buckled in the center, pulling back slightly. The Roman army, sensing victory, pushed forward into the gap. They thought they were breaking him. Then Hannibal's cavalry hit them from the flanks. At the same moment, his African heavy infantry wheeled inward from the wings. The entire Roman army, all 86,000 men, found themselves surrounded, trapped. When it was over, estimates suggest between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers lay dead on the field. Another 10,000 were captured. It was, by some measures, the most catastrophic military defeat ever suffered by a Western power until the 20th century. The city of Rome itself seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse. Senators met in crisis. Some wondered if they should surrender. A delegation went to negotiate with Hannibal, believing Rome had been beaten. But Rome did not surrender. And this is where something fundamental changed in Hannibal's mind, though he would not fully admit it until Zama. After Cannae, everything should have gone Hannibal's way. The math was simple. He had beaten Rome's armies in every engagement. Rome was exhausted. Rome was traumatized. Rome should have sued for peace. Instead, Rome committed to a different strategy. The Romans appointed a new leader, Fabius Maximus, with a mandate: stop trying to beat Hannibal. Instead, starve him out, harass him, avoid his army, wear down his supplies. Make the war so long, so grinding, so impossible to win that Hannibal would eventually have to withdraw. It was genius, and it was torture for Hannibal. For the first time in his life, Hannibal faced an enemy who would not fight him on his terms. He could not force a decisive battle. He controlled Italy's southern regions, but Rome still held the center and north. Every month that passed, Hannibal's supplies dwindled. His army started to decline. Soldiers who had followed him across the Alps began to die not in battle, but from hunger, disease, and despair. Hannibal wrote letters to Carthage demanding reinforcements, demanding supplies, demanding that his government send his brother Hasdrubal with a new army to help him crush Rome. The letters we have on record show frustration, urgency, and something else, the first hints of doubt. One letter to the Carthaginian Senate, written around 210 BCE after a decade of inconclusive warfare in Italy, essentially said this: I need help. If you do not send reinforcements, I cannot hold this position forever. Those were not the words of a man who believed he was invincible. And Carthage did try. Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal, crossed the Alps in 208 BCE with a fresh army. For a moment, it seemed like the plan might work. Two Carthaginian armies, one under Hannibal and one under Hasdrubal, could coordinate and crush Rome. Then Hasdrubal was defeated and killed at the Metaurus River in 27 BCE. The Romans intercepted Hasdrubal before he could link up with Hannibal. They defeated him in a decisive engagement. When Hasdrubal's severed head was thrown into Hannibal's camp as a message, Hannibal finally understood something he had been resisting for years: Rome would never surrender to him. This is the key moment in understanding what Hannibal would write about Zama, because Zama was not the moment he discovered defeat. Zama was the moment he finally accepted what he had known for 10 years, that he could not win. By 204 BCE, after 22 years of fighting, the strategic situation had shifted completely. Hannibal had failed to take Rome. He had failed to force Rome to surrender. And now, a new Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio had done something brilliant. He had invaded Carthage's homeland. Scipio landed in North Africa with the explicit goal of forcing Hannibal to leave Italy and return home to defend Carthage. For 13 years, Hannibal had been the hunter. Now, suddenly, he was the hunted. In 203 BCE, the Carthaginian Senate recalled Hannibal from Italy. For 17 years, he had held the Italian peninsula. He had been the terror of Rome, the ghost that Rome could not kill, the general whose very name caused Roman mothers to use it to scare children into obedience. And now he was leaving. Going home, but not as a conqueror, as a last resort. Hannibal took his remaining troops, veterans who had followed him across the Alps, who had fought in every major battle, who were the hard core of his military genius, and sailed to North Africa. With him went approximately 12,000 of his best soldiers. Men who, if trained properly, might still win him the victory that had eluded him in Italy. When Hannibal arrived in North Africa, he immediately sought out Scipio to negotiate. Peace talks had been ongoing. Perhaps, Hannibal reasoned, a negotiated settlement was possible. The terms Rome had previously offered were not good, but at least Carthage would survive. Scipio rejected them. The two generals met in person, a rare event in ancient warfare. They could see each other face to face. Hannibal, now in his mid-40s, grizzled from 17 years of war. Scipio, in his early 30s, the young genius who had studied Hannibal's tactics and learned how to counter them. What they said to each other is partially recorded in ancient sources. Hannibal is said to have warned Scipio that fortune is fickle, that Rome's triumph would not last forever, that today's victor is tomorrow's vanquished. Scipio listened respectfully but would not negotiate. Rome would not accept Carthage as it was. Carthage had to be broken, humiliated, reduced to vassalage. Hannibal returned to his army, and for the first time in his military life, he prepared for battle, knowing he might lose. The plain of Zama was flat. This was the opposite of what Hannibal wanted. His entire tactical system was built on complex maneuvering using terrain to divide enemy forces, using cavalry to hit from unexpected angles, using surprise and deception to create chaos. Flat terrain favored straightforward tactics, straight-up hammer-and-anvil warfare. Hannibal had assembled an army of approximately 40,000 men, a mix of his 12,000 Italian veterans, Carthaginian recruits, and mercenaries from across North Africa. He had 80 war elephants, the symbol of Carthaginian power. Scipio had approximately 30,000 men, fewer in number, but superior in cavalry, and probably better trained overall. On the morning of October 19, 202 BCE, Hannibal deployed his forces. And here, in this deployment, we see the first hint of his desperation. Hannibal placed his elephants at the front of his line, intending to use them to break Scipio's infantry formation. It was a tactic that had worked before. Elephants terrified ancient armies. The sight of them could cause soldiers to panic and break. But Scipio was ready for them. Scipio had designed his formation with gaps, literal holes in his line, where his skirmishers could take position. When Hannibal's elephants charged, they ran into Veliti's light infantry armed with javelins and spears. The elephants, instead of breaking the Roman line, were diverted into these gaps. Some of them ran sideways and actually disrupted Hannibal's own cavalry. In minutes, Hannibal's primary advantage was neutralized. Then the infantry engaged. Hannibal's first two lines were mercenaries and new recruits. They fought hard but could not break the Romans. Hannibal kept his Italian veterans in reserve, waiting for the critical moment when he could commit them and overwhelm Scipio. But that moment never came. The Roman cavalry, superior in numbers and coordination, drove Hannibal's cavalry from the field. With his cavalry gone, Hannibal's flanks were exposed. Scipio's cavalry wheeled around and attacked the rear of Hannibal's infantry. Hannibal's men were caught between the Roman frontal assault and the cavalry assault from behind. They were surrounded, the exact tactic Hannibal had used to such devastating effect at Cannae. By the end of the day, approximately 20,000 Carthaginian soldiers were dead. Another 20,000 were captured. The Roman losses were approximately 1,500. Hannibal had been beaten at his own game. When Hannibal understood that the battle was lost, he did not linger. He mounted his horse and rode toward Hadrumetum, a Carthaginian port city east of Zama, where he had estates. The man who had held Rome at bay for 17 years was now a fugitive. What Hannibal wrote about his defeat comes to us primarily through what happened next. Because while we don't have his personal memoirs, we have his actions, and in those actions we can read his analysis of what went wrong. Within weeks of the defeat, Hannibal returned to Carthage and went directly to the Senate. The senators expected him to be broken, ashamed, angry. Instead, he walked in and calmly told them the truth. I have lost not only the battle, but the war. We must accept Rome's peace terms. This was the hardest thing Hannibal Barca ever said. The man who had sworn eternal hatred for Rome, the man who had held an empire at bay, the man whose very name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. This man stood before the Senate of Carthage and told them to surrender. But that single statement, "I have lost not only the battle but the war," contains Hannibal's entire analysis of what happened. He understood, finally and completely, that military victory was no longer possible. It had not been possible for 10 years. Zama was just the moment when the possibility died officially, irrevocably. The real defeat had happened slowly. It was in the Fabian strategy that wore him down in Italy. It was in the failure of Carthage to send reinforcements. It was in the moment at the Metaros River when Hasdrubal died. It was in the 17 years of fighting without conquering Rome, without forcing Rome to accept his terms, without achieving the total military victory that Hannibal believed was possible. Zama was just the final truth spoken out loud. In the historical record, we have fragments of what Hannibal is said to have written or reflected on in the years after Zama. He discussed with the Carthaginian Senate the need to reform Carthage's finances to pay the Roman indemnity. He focused on practical concerns, how to rebuild, how to survive, how to ensure Carthage would not be destroyed completely. But in one statement that survives attributed to him by the Greek historian Polybius, who had access to sources close to Hannibal reflected on the battle itself. "If I had done everything possible to win and yet failed, despite being undefeated previously, then forgiveness is due. Fortune sometimes acts against the designs of good men." This is what Hannibal wrote about his greatest defeat, not that he had made tactical errors, not that his men were cowardly, not that Rome was cheating, but that fortune had turned against him, that he had done everything he could and it was not enough. This is the wisdom of a man who finally accepted that the world does not bend to individual genius, that armies are made of humans who get tired, who starve, who die. That logistics matter more than brilliance. That time itself is a weapon. After Zama, Hannibal lived another 16 years. Carthage elected him as a magistrate, a sign of respect despite his failure. He enacted reforms to help Carthage pay its indemnity to Rome, but the Romans, threatened even by the idea of Hannibal as a civilian administrator, demanded his exile. He fled to the east, eventually serving as an advisor to various Hellenistic kingdoms that opposed Rome, but he never again commanded an army in major battle. That part of his life was over. Near the end of his life, surrounded by enemies, facing capture by Roman forces, Hannibal chose death rather than face them. He took poison, but before he died, he allegedly left behind one final message to his enemies: "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." Even in death, Hannibal refused to give Rome the satisfaction of capturing him. He controlled his own ending. What Hannibal wrote about his greatest defeat through his actions, his letters, his final reflections was this: victory in war is not about being smarter than your enemy. It is about being right about the nature of the conflict itself. Hannibal was a tactical genius. He probably never faced a general as capable as Scipio, but he had beaten Rome repeatedly through brilliant maneuvering and superior tactics. But tactics are not strategy. And strategy is not the same as understanding the deeper nature of the war you are fighting. Hannibal understood finally that Rome could not be beaten by military genius alone. Rome was a different kind of enemy. Rome had infinite recruits. Rome had a system of alliances that meant defeat in one region could be offset by victory in another. Rome had a home base it could defend. Rome had a government that refused to surrender even after catastrophic military defeats. Hannibal had assumed that military victory automatically meant political victory. Knock Rome's army off the field enough times and Rome will fall. But Rome did not work that way. When Hannibal wrote through his surrender, through his admission, through his exile that fortune had turned against him, he was describing something deeper than luck. He was describing the moment when he finally grasped that the war was not winnable because his understanding of what would end the war had been wrong from the beginning. The field of Zama is empty now. Archaeologists are still not entirely certain where it was located. The battle that changed the world has been lost to history, buried under sand and time. But what Hannibal wrote about it lives on. Because his defeat taught Rome something crucial, military genius is not enough. Strategy must be rooted in an accurate understanding of your enemy and the true nature of the conflict. Rome learned this lesson and used it to conquer the Mediterranean world. Hannibal taught them, through his defeat, that wars are won not by one brilliant tactical victory after another, but by the side that understands the true shape of the conflict and refuses to surrender. Hannibal Barca spent 17 years trying to destroy Rome through military genius. He would spend the rest of his life understanding that he had lost the moment he failed to understand Rome itself. And in that understanding bitter, hard-won and finally honest Hannibal wrote the greatest lesson about defeat that the ancient world ever recorded.